Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of November 8th, 2020. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I am the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party, and we are looking forward to a stimulating and multifaceted philosophical conversation today. But first, let me introduce our panelists from the US Transhumanist Party. We have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton. We have our Secretary, Pavel Ilin. We have our Director of Sentient Rights Advocacy, Tom Ross. We have our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker, and for our special guest today, we have none other than David Pearce, an eminent transhumanist thinker, one of the, I would say, foundational thinkers of the transhumanist movement. He was one of the co-founders of the World Transhumanist Association back in 1998. And he is well known for his thinking on the abolition of suffering, as well as many other subjects that we hope to delve into today. But let's start with the abolition of suffering, because this is a distinctive view within the transhumanist philosophy that really transcends a lot of the prior paradigms about suffering. Most philosophical frameworks throughout human history have either counseled people to accept the reality of suffering, so to speak, or to try to change one's mindset about it. So for example, Stoicism would say, yes, you're suffering, deal with it. Buddhism would say the way to get rid of suffering is to get rid of your desires, to try to lead a life so that you minimize the amount of contact you come into with suffering. But transhumanism is different. Transhumanism actually holds that you can solve suffering in this world through the application of science and technology. So David, would you like to talk about some of these distinctive differences?
Thank you, Gennady. Yes, how does one summarize transhumanism in a sentence? And I often invoke the three supers: super longevity, super intelligence, and super happiness. And by super happiness, I include what one might call the abolitionist project, set out, you could say, by Gautama Buddha, but nonetheless a Buddhist approach to suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path, doesn't actually tackle the biological genetic roots of the problem. And what transhumanism offers is the vision of a world with a different motivational architecture. Most of us, let's say today, on average, most of us spend a lot of our lives a little bit above or a little bit below hedonic zero, and let's say our hedonic range schematically is -10 to 0 to +10. That's obviously quite schematic. Yet as we master our reward circuitry and the basis of pleasure in the central nervous system, it will be possible to construct a civilization based on gradients of intelligent superhuman bliss. And this isn't talk of maximizing happiness, but rather ratcheting up our hedonic range and hedonic set points. And this is quite an important point, because talking at a time, just the results of the US presidential election coming in, bitter, seemingly irreconcilable conflict. But one of the advantages of aiming to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill and hedonic uplift is that it's possible to conserve people's existing values and preference architecture if they want to. Because part of the problem today is that so many people, not just people, sentient beings, have irreconcilable desires and preferences that are logically impossible to satisfy. And hedonic uplift doesn't, in one sense, it doesn't solve the problem. But in another sense, by ratcheting up hedonic range and hedonic set points, you can enrich everyone's default quality of life. Obviously, the abolitionist project is, in one sense, it's tremendously ambitious, but it's not all philosophical talk, because we're already seeing the first CRISPR babies. Now, they were not conceived in ideal circumstances, but nonetheless, if we are prepared to advocate universal access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, CRISPR genome editing, with even a handful of tweaks, it'll be possible for prospective parents to choose the pain sensitivity and approximate hedonic set points of their future children. And this is going to be true not just with humans, but also the entire biosphere too. I'm, as you know, an advocate of veganism, radical veganism. I think our treatment of non-human animals is monstrous, but the only way I know to get rid of the horrors of animal agriculture this century and to get factory farms and slaughterhouses shut and outlawed is cultured mass production, commercialization of cultured meat. And I think once it actually hits the supermarket shelves, i.e. meat, cultured meat that is cruelty-free, exactly the same taste and texture as existing products of live animals, I think it'll be possible to get factory farms and slaughterhouses shut and outlawed. And the final leg of the abolitionist project on Earth, at least, is going to be the rest of the living world. And intuitively, the problem of wild animal suffering might seem insoluble. There is absolutely frightful suffering in nature, starvation, predation. But a combination of CRISPR, genome editing, and synthetic gene drives, in principle at any rate, allows us with recognizable extensions of existing technologies to reprogram the biosphere and ratchet up hedonic range, hedonic set points, pain sensitivity across entire species. And yeah, what really daunt me are the, shall we say, the political obstacles. I mean, the scientific problems are many and varied, and there are countless pitfalls, but they're all fixable. I could say a lot more, but rather than my doing so, I thought early on perhaps we could just open up if anyone has any particular questions or aspects of the abolitionist project you'd like us to tackle. I mean, we can consider obviously the role of aging as one terrible form of suffering, but it's a multifaceted project.
Yes, indeed. And thank you, David, for this introduction. I think you outlined a lot of fascinating areas that we could delve into from here. First, I do like your suggestion about delving into aging as a major source of suffering, because this is a core aim of transhumanism, to reverse biological aging, hopefully within all of our lifetimes. Aubrey de Grey has outlined the SENS approach, how to address each of the 7 principal causes of age-related damage from an engineering standpoint, and increasingly the scientific community is coming around to accepting the theoretical validity of that approach. So what are some of your thoughts about how the fight against aging and the alleviation of suffering would go hand in hand? I mean, to us transhumanists, it seems rather obvious, rather intuitive. Where do you think the blocks are for the majority of the public still to accept this notion that it should be an obvious moral imperative to turn around the biological clock, given that everyone who knows anything about aging understands the debilitation that it brings about.
Yes, I think inevitably a lot of people listening and hearing transhumanists talk about the abolition of aging, I mean, we all tend to be self-referential, and I think a lot of people would probably think, yes, science perhaps one day is going to defeat aging, but by the time it happens, I'll be dead and buried. And it's quite unsettling if one is, in some sense, subverting the rationalizations that people have about aging and death being good, particularly given right now it's not as though we have a panacea to offer. And this is one reason I very much hope that the two big strands of anti-aging, the cryonics approach and the SENS approach, are actually combined. And so I think it's highly politically desirable that there should be opt-out cryonics and opt-in cryoeuthanasia. Now, this is controversial, but everyone who listens to transhumanists talking about the abolition of aging ought to feel that they've got some skin in the game and they can potentially benefit. In the case of opt-out cryonics, it would be much, much cheaper if it were made widely available. Cryoeuthanasia would be much more controversial, but my thinking there is that essentially, yeah, if you wait till you're 95 in Gaga, and essentially you're suspended in suboptimal conditions, a far more advanced technological civilization is going to be needed to recreate even a passable imitation of you. Whereas if you are, let's say, I don't know what age it would be, 70, 75, the time of your choosing, suspended in absolutely optimal conditions, then it's going to be much easier for your grandchildren to arrange for your reanimation. So this would take a regulatory change, not just a technical change, but I think it's something to consider from a PR perspective. And there isn't as much, isn't as close liaison as I would like to see between the SENS approach and the cryonics approach. In fairness, I should probably mention the other approach that some transhumanists argue. This is so-called mind uploading, which involves the notional scanning, digitizing, and uploading to a less perishable medium of the human mind brain. Now, for technical and philosophical reasons, I am extremely skeptical that this could work, even in principle. I'm happy to say more about this if people are interested, but I was adding this more for the sake of completeness.
Yes, indeed. And the mind uploading discussion is one that we definitely should get into, especially because we had a virtual Enlightenment Salon with Ken Hayworth of the Brain Preservation Foundation and Robert McIntyre of Nectome. And then we had another virtual Enlightenment Salon with Greg Fahey and Rudy Hoffman on the subject of cryonics and cryogenic preservation and what could reliably be preserved using current technologies, what we still have significant obstacles to preserving. And it's interesting because during those salons, I articulated my own perspective, which is that essentially we can be certain of being alive right now. And in whatever state, my preference would be to stay alive as long as possible, If I need to resort to cryonics, it would be plan B, not plan A. Plan A is for me not to die. And I think for a lot of transhumanists, that is plan A. So the cryonics option is a fallback because there are these challenges about, well, how reliable is the cryopreservation? What would the revival look like? But I'm one of those people who would say, yes, if I'm 105 and frail and I have dementia, I would still want to hang on until I'm 110 or 115, however long medical science can keep me alive. And if I reach legal death and cryonics is cost effective at that point in time, certainly I hope it would be more cost effective by then than it is now. And hopefully I won't be in that situation. It would be a situation where the world would have stagnated quite a bit for me to have to resort to that option at 115. But I would still prefer that to, say, if I'm 75 and in reasonably good health, pursuing that option, because again, for those intervening 40 years, I would still have some sort of guaranteed existence, given the ability of medical technology to keep me alive. So Ken Hayworth and I had quite a bit of a disagreement on that, because he is a proponent of kind of elective euthanasia, where one would go in, have one's brain preserved using glutaraldehyde, and then some centuries hence, one would experience this destructive mind uploading. Well, experience is a strange term because it's not the pre-preservation self that would experience anything. And my argument to him was the result would be, if it's conscious and self-aware, it would be a copy, essentially, and it would have its own distinctive I-ness, its own distinctive vantage point. And Ken Hayworth kind of responded to that by saying, it's essentially not a relevant concept as long as the pattern of the information is preserved. But you've raised the point that this reinstantiated entity, it might look sophisticated to the external observer, but it might not actually be conscious itself. And I think to address the minimization of suffering, we do need to delve into this question of what constitutes the prerequisites of consciousness. How do we know that consciousness is preserved in the face of physical transformations? And if you believe there are obstacles to a digital entity being conscious, like an android or an uploaded mind, what would you say fundamentally those obstacles are?
Yes, it is not known, and the hard problem of consciousness is generally well known. Why aren't we P-zombies? Having this conversation now, but it's not even all dark inside. But there's another problem too that is perhaps less widely discussed. This is the so-called binding problem. And that even if consciousness is fundamental to the world, as some panpsychists imagine, why aren't you right now essentially a bunch of 86 billion membrane-bound discrete pixels of experience interacting with each other? Yes, but nonetheless, why aren't you a micro-experiential zombie? By analogy, the population of the United States, each 330 million skull-bound minds intercommunicating, and yet you don't have a continental subjective experience. How are brains different? Or to use a slightly different example, imagine a classical Turing machine. Imagine replacing the ones and zeros with discrete pixels of experience, and now execute the code. However fast the speed of execution, however complex the code, all you have is a micro-experiential zombie, unless there is so-called spooky strong emergence, which is indistinguishable from magic. Unless we actually can crack the hard problem, and unless we can actually crack the binding problem, yeah, I don't think we can be confident that a classical digital computer is going to support subjects of experience. And yeah, on various theoretical grounds, I don't think classical digital computers are ever going to be more than micro experiential zombies. Sure, they can outperform us in increasingly many cognitive domains, but nonetheless, they are not going to wake up and start talking about consciousness. I mean, sure, if one wants to do so, one can program or train up digital computer to deceive gullible humans, but nonetheless, yeah, it's not even all dark inside.
Very interesting. Now, in terms of the prerequisites of consciousness, I'm of the view that we know that we are conscious, we experience it directly. And while some schools of thought try to deny the very fact of consciousness simply because it can't be explained within a kind of simplistic paradigm, I, as a materialist, would say we know that the material world works in certain ways. We know from direct experience that consciousness exists. Something has to bridge the two. And I would say consciousness is an emergent property of the material world at a certain level of complexity, just as life is an emergent property at a certain level of complexity where an entity is able to sustain itself, take in energy from the environment, replicate itself, etc. And there are some questions about what constitutes the boundary of life, such as, is a virus alive? But we can clearly say a gazelle is alive, whereas a rock is not alive. Likewise, we can clearly say we are conscious, whereas a diamond is not conscious. So there could be fuzzy boundaries, but very clear instances of something that is on one side and something that is on the other side. But do you think there's something inherent about biological structures that would be a necessary prerequisite for consciousness? Or if you could assemble an android, for example, with components from other substrates, like this android might not have anything carbon based in it, but it would have very similar structures to the human brain, the human heart, the human lungs, in terms of the functions they perform. Could that entity be conscious?
Yeah, there's two separate questions. There's the hard problem of consciousness and the binding problem. Now, how can they be solved within a scientific paradigm? I think a lot of people assume that either one must be a scientific materialist or one surrenders to mysticism and kind of religious obscurantism. And this is one reason for the growth of so-called eliminativism, that given scientists, chemists, physicists, they think they understand the basic structure of matter and energy, there is seemingly no place for consciousness. Therefore, in some sense, it must be an illusion. But as you were saying, I am conscious. This is a very Cartesian thought, but it is just about the only it's the only thing one ever knows directly, one's own consciousness. And if someone has no place for subjective experience in their ontology of the world, then so much the worse for their theory of the world. Now, one possibility, which you touched on, was some form of emergentism. 200 years ago, biological life seemed irreducible to basic physics, but we now know that living organisms can be reduced via molecular biology to quantum chemistry to fundamental physics. And I think a lot of people assume that somehow this explanatory gap can be closed and that the properties of our conscious minds can be ultimately reduced to biology, chemistry, and physics. But no one has the slightest clue within this paradigm how to achieve any kind of reduction. There's not even the ghost of an idea. So of late, there has been a modest academic revival of the so-called intrinsic nature argument. And I personally explore a version of non-materialist physicalism. The physicalism is relatively straightforward. This is the idea that the world is exhaustively described by the equations of mathematical physics. The standard model or its speculative extension is all there is. But nonetheless, what is the intrinsic nature of the physical? The fire in the equations. Kant's noumenal essence of the world. Science doesn't say, not even hardcore materialists say. I mean, it's a very plausible, intuitive assumption that the fire in the equations is non-experiential. But if you drop this metaphysical assumption that the fire in the equations is non-experiential, then it is possible to transpose the entire mathematical apparatus of modern science onto an idealist ontology. Now, I'm not an advocate. I don't know if this is true. But if you want an account of the natural world, including conscious humans, that is empirically adequate and has predictive power, it is possible to pursue as I said, it's been called the intrinsic nature argument. It can be traced via, most recently, Phil Goff, Galen Strawson, back via Bertrand Russell, ultimately to Schopenhauer. But this is, as I said, it's physicalist. Science is formally complete, yet the actual intrinsic nature of a quantum field is not what one's naive materialist intuitions might suppose. But this is critical. Even if consciousness is fundamental to the world, even if quantum field theory describes fields of sentience rather than insentience, one still needs to explain the unity of consciousness. When you are dreamlessly asleep, well, yeah, perhaps you're still a micro-experiential zombie, but something happens when you wake up. Instead of being 86 billion discrete membrane-bound pixels of experience, you, as in right now, can apprehend or instantiate multiple phenomenally feature-bound objects, perceptual objects. This is sort of local binding and also global binding, the unity of the self, the unity of perception. And I don't think that classical physics and traditional neuroscience can actually accommodate phenomenal binding. Now, David Chalmers, in a paper on the combination problem, argues that this structural mismatch between what naive neuroscanning says about your brain and the phenomenology of our minds means that we should embrace dualism. But my best guess, and it is only a guess, though it's a testable guess, is that once sufficiently fine-grained neuroscanning and interferometry is possible, that a perfect structural match will be deciphered inside one's skull between what you're experiencing right now and fundamental physics. This is a version of quantum mind. Anyone interested can read up on it. Wikipedia gives a very skeptical account of my quantum mind approach, but on physicalism.com I discuss it. Unlike Roger Penrose, Stuart Hameroff, the so-called orchestrated objective reduction model, it doesn't invoke any new physics, but nonetheless, it's extremely far-fetched. Essentially, I argue that phenomenal binding is a form of superposition, that we're a bunch of cat states, and what naive neuroscanning suggests is distributed feature processes in the brain, edge detectors, motion detectors, color mediating neurons, and so forth, are actually individual superpositions. Now, sorry for that. That's all garbled and a bit of a mouthful. But I would stress I'm not urging any new physics. Simply the unitary Schrödinger dynamics. And why
Yes,
would
indeed.
if any physicist were listening, why would they be skeptical? It's because the effective lifetime of neuronal superpositions in the CNS, cat states, is essentially femtoseconds or less. But one person's reductio ad absurdum is another person's falsifiable prediction. And I predict that when molecular matter wave interferometry is sufficiently sensitive, a perfect structural match will be found between what you're experiencing right now and the underlying physics.
Yes, that is fascinating. And I would highlight the concept of the unity of self as really an essential one for transhumanists, because that, to me, is what we're seeking to preserve ultimately through biological life extension or any other approaches that people might contemplate. If the unity of self is lost, if we become disassociated into billions or trillions of atoms, then what is the point? And I remember when I was 14, my mind was preoccupied with these kinds of questions like, what is the meaning of life? I still hadn't learned about the Sens approach yet, so I was thinking about human mortality, and I was aware of the explanations of some materialists like atoms are in most cases not destructible, so your atoms get recycled, and you might be breathing in an atom that was part of Aristotle at some point. But kind of, I never found that to be comforting, because I realized that, well, that atom isn't capable of doing what Aristotle was capable of doing. Aristotle isn't aware that his atom might be circulating somewhere in North America right now. So that seemed to me more to be a device for consolation than for anything else. But I wanted to preserve this unitary self. And there are different views in the transhumanist community about what the self is. Some people adhere to this patternist view, and I know Ken Hayworth does, Robert McIntyre does, to some extent Ben Goertzel does, where they say the information about you, the precise pattern of your memories, your experiences, etc., is what constitutes you. And I would disagree with that. I would say the self, the unitary identity, it's a process. So it's all of these interactions within the body and the mind that somehow generate this unitary perception of self. And if one were to instantiate a similar process in a different entity, one could even hypothetically do it simultaneously with the original being alive. So if somebody 3D printed a version of me right next to me, that person would also have a perception of self and go off and have his own life, but I wouldn't be directly aware of it. So there's something about this particular process that's happening within us right now that is constantly changing, whose components, whose substrate is turning over. And yet there's this unitary perception that I think is the core of what we're seeking to preserve. So I'm curious where you fall on this pattern versus process question. It seems like you're much closer to the process view.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of issues here. If one's talking about the unity of the self, philosophers distinguish between the synchronic and the diachronic unity of the self, and though philosophers use a lot of jargon, this is actually quite useful. I mean, there is this scientific mystery. Why is it right now that instead of being a micro experiential zombie, you are a unified subject of experience? But just as problematic in some ways is the so-called, the diachronic identity of the self, and this I'm tend to be much more skeptical of. That yes, our whole kind of conceptual scheme is implicitly committed to enduring metaphysical egos, that one is born, one lives for currently 70, 80, 90 years, and then dies. But what is the bearer of identity? Should one worry about it? I mean, when one wakes up in the morning, one has not got identical atoms and molecules to the person who went to sleep the night before, nor are they constituted in the same way. But one doesn't, for the most part, undergo some kind of existential crisis of identity. What is it that one actually wants to preserve? And here you'll get very different answers. Essentially, if you love life and love who you are now, then you probably want to preserve something remarkably similar. Sadly, though most transhumanists tend to be life-loving optimists, I tend to be much more malaise-ridden. I have a very dark Darwinian mind, and the entity I would like to see created bears only a tenuous relationship to its ancestral namesake. But nonetheless, I still think it's extremely important, even if you have a very dark view of Darwinian life, to phase out the biology of involuntary aging. So I've only skimmed the surface of some of the issues here. Anyone who doesn't think that defeating the biology of aging is important, who thinks we should just be focused on suffering or pain or depression, if you ever visit an old age people's home or have an elderly relative who is sadly losing their faculties, it's pretty grim.
Yes, indeed. And the quest to defeat biological aging is one that really unites essentially all transhumanists, no matter what they think the outcome of that is going to be. They are to some extent or another significantly committed to that. This is why significant life extension achieved through the progress of science and technology is the first core ideal of the US Transhumanist Party. So thank you for those remarks, David. Now I would like to go around to the US Transhumanist Party officers to see if they have any questions or comments for David.
I'd like to ask a very general question, which is looking at a lot of your writing is, thinking about the far future, but looking at right now, what technologies are you most excited about for specifically reducing suffering? Or are there any pharmaceutical, things that you're interested in?
I can mention perhaps several. First is the discovery this year, one of the few good things about 2020, of a novel dual function receptor in the central nervous system that appears to modulate the level of endogenous opioids in the CNS. And this is tremendously significant because, in principle, if you administer blockers to this newly discovered receptor, it ought to be possible to tackle pain, depression, and even raise hedonic set points of sort of default hedonic tone of people who don't fulfill the criteria for clinical depression. Now, needless to say, there are profound potential pitfalls here, but the US is in the throes of an opioid crisis. Existing antidepressants do not successfully treat many millions of people. And I would like to see a crash program of research into this, as I said, it's the Luxembourg Institute of Health made this particular discovery. And by blocking this receptor, the brain's endogenous opioids, their level and function is increased. And so in theory, using centrally active receptor blockers with perhaps selective kappa opioid antagonists could raise everyone's default hedonic tone. Now, if I'm not sounding more enthusiastic than perhaps I ought to be, it's that the history of psychopharmacology, psychiatry is littered with false dawns. But nonetheless, yeah, for the first time in many years, I've actually been thrilled by a discovery in neuroscience. This is potentially a game changer. I mean, I can obviously say more. A couple of other areas. Yeah, I mean, culture. Yeah, we mentioned this earlier. I think it is that there is a tremendous moral imperative to develop and commercialize cultured meat, and I would like to say abolish factory farms and slaughterhouses now. But what might be politically feasible, if we are prepared to accelerate the commercialization and development of cultured meat, is to enact legislation that closes factory farms and slaughterhouses, let's say by the year 2030. So that gives a tremendous commercial incentive for firms to develop cultured meat products. It doesn't involve the slightest personal inconvenience to consumers now, but it might conceivably be politically realistic, because there was an extraordinary study done by the Sentient Institute whose results were so incredible I didn't believe it till the study was replicated. 47% of Americans, if asked, said they would support the abolition of slaughterhouses. Not would you go vegan or vegetarian, nothing like that. Just simply, and as I said, this study has been replicated, and
there's probably a framing effect there.
Yeah,
calling it a slaughterhouse probably brings up different imagery that may evoke a different response than previous surveys. So that's interesting.
I think so, and it's I think a lot of people, if you meat, I mean, I've never tasted meat. I'm a third generation vegetarian vegan, but I think a lot of people, they're shopping in the supermarket, they're eating the functional equivalent of roadkill in some sense. But so I mean, this is frustrating because, of course, I want to say what we're doing now to non-human animals. I mean, a pig as sentient as a small child is absolutely monstrous. But calling for the abolition, I mean, it's not politically feasible. But it might be feasible if you enact legislation that kicks in, a decade from now,
and maybe bring in the climate change angle as well. Right, because cultured meat would be less impact on CO2.
It's certainly relevant. I mean, as I say, it doesn't loom as large for me as it does for some people. Imagine if use a rather ghastly analogy. Imagine if one was urging, kind of closing the death factories in 1944 because ashes from the crematoria were polluting the local environment. I mean, it's important. Climate change is a whole issue in itself. Can we avoid geoengineering and so on? But the moral issue. Yeah.
Speaking pragmatically, but
absolutely. No, I know. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And in terms of what is feasible, talking about in the next few decades rather than the far future that some transhumanists discuss. Should we be offering universal access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, and soon CRISPR. I said it was extremely unfortunate that, and the scientists who conducted the experiment on CRISPR babies in China, the pretext, as you know, was the kids were going to be protected from HIV. It seems from animal models that non-human animals with the mutation in question seem to have enhanced cognitive performance, superior memory. The scientist was almost certainly trying to create smart designer babies, and he was not acting alone either. We don't know the full details. Although in the West, unfortunately, as soon as one starts talking about genetic manipulation, choice, there's this specter of eugenics. But yeah, every kid born today is a unique, untested genetic experiment, and somehow we need to get this shift so that if one thinks it is ethically permissible to bring new life and suffering into the world, if one considers it ethically permissible to be a natalist and to have kids, then the responsible thing to do as a parent is to choose the attributes of your future child. And whereas something like a hot button issue such as intelligence is horrendously complicated and not well understood, even a handful of genetic tweaks could radically improve the default quality of life of future kids. And so, yeah, I think we need to have a public debate. Probably the way to frame it is going to be in the language of remediation rather than in enhancement. It's as has been well said. The enhancement of one generation is the remediation of the next. But probably, I would guess, a majority of people would support germline interventions if they involved correction of a recognizable disease. I mean, sickle cell disease or cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs or something like that. What becomes vastly more controversial is the issue of enhancement. But in the case of just focusing on pain sensitivity and hedonic set point, if the wider public, if it can be more widely recognized that depression is an absolutely frightful disorder, low mood, and hundreds of millions of people in the world today are either clinically or subclinically depressed, that whereas for transhumanists, one of the big problems is life is too short. There are hundreds of millions of people for whom life drags on too long. And if we are going to be creating new babies, let's make sure that they have a high default hedonic set point and high pain thresholds. Not yet, and this, looking ahead to the future, is what I hope is going to happen. Not yet an entire architecture of information sensitive gradients of well-being, not yet completely abolishing the raw feels of pain, but ratcheting up pain thresholds, hedonic set point, so that, if one looks at today's genetic outliers, the kind of person who is tremendous appetite for life. And Anders Sandberg will say, yeah, I do have a ridiculously high hedonic set point. Or or someone who says such things as, pain, it's just a useful signaling mechanism. Ratcheting up defaults so that, our children or grandchildren don't have to suffer in the way we do. So those are.
I think I think we need more people out there preaching that gospel, really. And I don't want to hog the question, but it will require some education, because a lot of people don't even realize that there's a genetic component to depression or kind of an evolutionary basis for it. Right.
Yes, non-social animals don't seem to get depressed. They can suffer from starvation or fear, but depression seems to be an adaptation to to group living. It's a kind of internalized correlate to the losing subroutine. It's associated with behavioral suppression, learned helplessness.
It may be,
and
yeah, maybe related to status hierarchies, perhaps.
Yes, this is the rank theory of depression, that it could be absolutely disastrous in the ancestral environment if you challenge the dominant male and you got badly injured or ejected from the tribe. This could be lethal for a native ape, and yeah, essentially we need to tackle the biological genetic roots of the problem. And yeah, though transhumanists have potential potential solutions for a lack of material abundance, something like status, for example, it's essentially zero sum. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, so much more could be said there, but yeah, a lot of education is going to be needed. Sophisticated PR, marketing, a pretty thick skin too, because one will get all manner of abuse too. And of course, there are genuine worries. Who is going to take the decision? Is it going to be individual parents, or is it going to be perhaps a more Chinese model where perhaps the state decides that it wants to encourage children, parents to have extremely intelligent children by rather narrow criteria of intelligence, for example?
Yes, this is a great conversation, and interestingly enough, Liz Parrish has joined us at just the right time because, of course, of her pioneering work in the area of gene therapy. We would be interested in hearing your thoughts, Liz, about how these scientific and medical advances could address some of these problems that David was mentioning, including the genetic suboptimalities that many people struggle with, both physically and mentally.
Well, I love David Pearce. I love listening to him talk. I'm a vegetarian I'm an aspiring vegan. Of course, the animal rights and the cruelty that we put on other beings has been, a big point of my life. That part of self-evolution has to do with how we internally and externally manifest ourselves towards the world. So I'm so sorry I'm late. My God, this is definitely one talk I didn't want to miss. So I'm so inspired. I did have a question, and hopefully this will provoke some conversation. Being dissatisfied really is kind of a mother of invention. It's why I'm here. My son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2013, and I'd worked 2 years in the regenerative medicine area for the advocacy of the use of stem cells. But I really didn't have a big knowledge base on the future of mankind. I was not as brilliant as most people on this call were as a child. I thought, that's it, I don't want to die. So I essentially went looking for cures for kids, and then I came into this zone of genetics to treat biological aging because it actually helps everyone, the young and old, all alike. What could you say about the difference between depression and being dissatisfied? Like, I love the hedonic state being lifted up, but how do we make sure that we're still innovating? Andrew Sandberg is one of our scientific advisors, by the way, and I love him. And he is an example of being happy, being satisfied, but wanting more. Are there guarantees that would work for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point, because although it is adaptive for a minority of people to be depressed, conditionally activated, sure, but nonetheless, there seems to be some adaptive role. In the case of spending a lot of one's life discontented, always wanting more, not counting one's blessings, essentially evolution designed us to be discontented a lot of the time. But nonetheless, it's going to be possible to retain the functional role of discontent without, the nasty raw feels. Increasingly, neuroscience is distinguishing between bliss and motivation. Crudely, bliss being activation, full new opioid agonists of your ultimate hedonic hotspots. Motivation involves dopaminergic mesolimbic dopamine system, and essentially it's going to be possible to twiddle the dials. Yes, it is going to be possible, if you want to be a blissfully happy lotus eater, to be a blissfully happy lotus eater, but not everyone likes this idea, and there's nothing in principle impossible about ensuring that people are vastly happier, but also hyper motivated. And dopamine crudely gives us this sense of urgency, things to be done. I mean, just to give to give an example, I play computer chess, and I'm discontented in one sense. I know I'm going to lose, but nonetheless, there's no suffering involved. And if I sort of looking ahead to a full-blown transhumanist civilization, yes, I think gradients of bliss, orders of magnitude richer than anything accessible today. But I would guess, so this is more speculative, that transhumans, posthumans are going to be hyper motivated too. It's as I said, it's much more speculative, but nonetheless, yeah, we don't have to choose between motivation and happiness. We can have both.
That's fantastic. And Janet, for what you were talking about, so in the gene therapy space, I mean, the first gene therapies have been embarked upon to affect dopamine levels in Parkinson's disease. Certainly, we're looking at Clotho for intelligence. We can't necessarily say that, intelligence would lead to an elated self, but PGC1 alpha was also looked at for Parkinson's disease, which also increases mitochondrial function, which increases energy levels in the people. So I imagine that, we're in the early stages where we look at gene therapies that affect aging and affect, in some cases, some mental conditions of aging like dementia and Parkinson's. But I have been asked by many people, David, how could we combat depression? I know a lot of people who suffer from depression, a lot of close friends of mine. It's a top priority. The truth of the matter is if you don't have a good mindset for the world, like David said, your life seems maybe too long already. And there are many people who are really reaching out to our company looking for some sort of access to something. But again, on the other side, speaking to Janeti about the gene therapies, where they're at, they're vastly all the basic research has been towards treating a physical condition of other parts of the body and not necessarily the mind, but I'm looking forward to that. David, do you feel like the world is ready to put an essential amount of funding or research into mental health now on the deeper side of genetics?
Oh, good heavens. Providing it is framed in the right way, and if it is, innovative treatments for refractory depression or something sounds sufficiently boring. But if one starts talking about let's create life based on gradients of superhuman bliss, most people are going to be freaked out by it. So I think, yeah, the framing is really important. And sure, if one is, shall we say, independent researcher or a philosopher, one doesn't need to be thinking precisely how is this going to play with the public. But if one is in politics with a message, it's really important to stay on message, to use the appropriate terminology. One extraordinary blessing is that, the World Health Organization, as its founding constitution, has a quite amazingly ambitious definition of health. Health is a state of complete physical, emotional, social well-being. Now, by such a criterion, essentially, no one in history has yet enjoyed good health. I think Anders Sandberg makes this point precisely in his forthcoming book, Grand Futures, where I was lucky enough to read a draft. So rather than saying, hey, we are transhumanists with this crazy new exciting ideology, wrapping ourselves in the mantle of good health. And I would love to see the transhumanist counterpart of Greta Thunberg, and I'm mispronouncing her name, sorry, haranguing World Health Organization, the United Nations, telling it to live up to its responsibilities. Because if we have that ambitious World Health Organization definition of health, the only way to guarantee good health for all is to tackle the biological genetic root of the problem. I'm hoping that with a Biden presidency that the USA will shortly be rejoining the WHO. Absolute tragedy and a scandal, the US withdrawing. So
it was interesting. In December of last year, I had a conversation with Rowan Horn, and he was admiring Greta Thunberg for her passionate advocacy on climate change. And we were thinking, well, what if she could direct even some of that passion toward advocating for research against biological aging, berating the politicians, the various authorities and medical institutions as in, why aren't you doing anything about this problem? Or why aren't you doing enough about this problem? In her characteristic style, I think that could make a difference. Of course, unfortunately, I don't know of any counterpart to her that would have exactly that same effect. A teenager who has this raw energy and passion and is willing to say things that adults are not willing to say and would be able to get away with them. But it's an interesting notion, and perhaps we should be on the lookout for such an individual. Now, a lot of this conversation, I think, is a good opportunity to bring in a question from one of our viewers in the chat, Why Not Now, who asks, what does one need to know about themselves in order to select optimal mood brightening, cognitive enhancing supplements, or is it purely trial and error? And I'll preface this by saying, for myself, I am extremely careful about anything that might affect the functioning of my mind. Generally, I'm quite content with it. I do drink a fair amount of caffeine, but caffeine has relatively mild side effects in that it can make one a bit more energetic and a bit more anxious, but generally the cognitive processes remain what they would have been otherwise. I'm extremely wary of anything that could derail my cognitive processes or alter them in substance. And I'll say a little bit about myself from the standpoint of hedonic set points. I think my default hedonic set point is a little bit below neutral, in the sense that if I am to not receive any sort of external stimulus, I would consider myself a kind of sober realist. I would say reality exists, it has a lot of problems, we can do something about them, and I see suboptimalities around me that I want to solve. I'm not depressive, and I have a hard time understanding people who are depressed because my hedonic set point doesn't go down that low. However, I find it necessary quite often to engage in intellectual activity in order to elevate it somewhat above neutral. So for example, today I am pleased that I got 8 hours of sleep, that I looked at some art this morning, that I'm here having this conversation with David Pearce. So my outlook on the world is mildly favorable right now. But I don't need anything special to achieve this. And the caffeine mostly helps keep me awake and functioning when I've had less than the optimal amount of sleep. So that's my perspective. But I wonder what you think, David, about that question and the degree of self-knowledge and trial and error that an individual would have to have in order to address this properly.
Yes, I mean, before even contemplating pharmacological options, yeah, it really is worth going down the naturopathic route and optimizing diet, sleep discipline, and aerobic exercise. And I tend to take the food that I eat as almost as seriously as some people would the particular kind of medication they might take. And that's not to say I would be racked by guilt if in a social situation I just had something on impulse, but nonetheless most of the time, yeah, what I eat is precisely calibrated. And although there has been, particularly with the growth of online drug markets and pharmacies, all kinds of nootropics, so-called smart drugs, nonetheless, yeah, a lot of them are not properly tested. It's very easy to confuse a psychostimulant with a cognitive enhancer. I mean, having said that, I drink coffee. Coffee seems to have an excellent track record. It's mood brightening. It improves cognitive performance on some measures. It may even extend life and reduce Alzheimer's and the likelihood of Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. But some of these other substances are very poorly tested. There's publication bias in trials. Inevitably, if people are trying to sell you something, it's likely to potentially corrupt your judgment. So yeah, as well as this holy trinity of diet, exercise, and sleep discipline, optimizing social contacts as far as is possible. Of course, easy to say because as Darwinian human social life is a minefield. There's the whole so-called hedgehog's dilemma that intimacy is extremely painful, and together with that, of course, we have lockdown. But yeah, before starting taking a cocktail of nootropics, yeah, get everything else right.
Yes, that is sound advice.
To echo that point, I've tried many nootropics, and none of them compare to optimizing my sleep. None of them come anywhere close to the benefits I've gotten from simple sleep hacks. And also aerobic exercise, I would say.
Yes, I can vouch for the benefits of aerobic exercise, most definitely. But go ahead, David.
No, I was just saying, something like modafinil, it's probably pretty benign. It's similar to coffee without the jitteriness. But if you're using it to subvert sort of your normal kind of sleep discipline, it's more likely in the long run that you're going to start suffering cognitive deficits. And this, I don't want to sound like a naturopath in that if the mind brain were better understood, there'll be all kinds of hacks that it's going to be possible to use. But right now, we just do not know enough. Honestly, it really is. It's going to be far easier technically to ratchet up mood and diminish pain than it is to be able to boost full spectrum intelligence and ultimately super intelligence. Yeah, I mean, if if I wanted to create full spectrum super intelligence, I would be doing such things as cloning with variations as recognized geniuses. What I would not be doing is necessarily tweaking the DNA of ordinary mortals.
This is interesting because a lot of our viewers in the chat point out the benefits of sleep, including Zach Richardson, Daniel Twett, Jason Geringer. Zach Richardson says, sleep expert Matthew Walker says 8 hours a night is the single best Alzheimer's preventer there is. And at the same time, sleep seems like such a time expenditure, especially for someone who wants to transform the world, who sees all of these action items that need to be addressed. Someone of my mindset thinks, well, what if it were possible to biologically reduce the need for sleep in humans so that we can get the same types of benefits without having to spend so much time? Do you think that's feasible in the medium term or long term future? And if so, how could that be achieved?
Well, we know that sleep and dreaming or something like it is extremely evolutionarily ancient and strongly conserved. So rather than just being, a question of some simple genetic tweak, I suspect it's going to take a pretty radical genetic rewrite. And so will post-humans sleep? Possibly not, I don't know. But if one is talking about this century, rather than trying to, get an extra hour of waking existence, I'd be going down the other route, just making sure one gets. I know people vary, but yeah, try to get 7 to 8 hours each night at a regular time, and it's probably likely to benefit you more than a smart truck.
Yes,
it's a rather
indeed.
boring answer. It's not as though, it is to some extent empirical. Yeah, one reads up all one can about a particular supplement and then perhaps cautiously self-experiment. But yeah, as I said, a bit boring, but given our ignorance, possibly wise.
Yeah, I would say I'd go back to, it's a very important question. And it may be useful to keep a journal during a week and take note of any time you're in a state that you want to be in most of the time. And what makes you blissful? Where are you in most in the flow? For some people, it is being asleep. I think with Gennady, we've obviously hit on he is blissful when he is productive and out there and doing things and not sleeping. Me, I discovered that I am most happy, most blissful when I am being productive and that people are relying on that productivity. And I think that's different for everybody. So it might be useful to customize whatever nootropics you go for or supplements by noticing when you are in that state you want to be in most of all. And now we'll have designer supplements for each one of those bliss states. But yeah, I think that's the way to go, is to first see when it is you're most happy. Some people are most happy when they're productive. I'm that way. Some people are happy when they have nothing to do. Nobody is calling. They're very alone, whatever it is. And, find whatever supplements that bliss state. That'd be my boring answer to a really important question.
Yes, thank you, Tom, for sharing those insights. And you also brought up a recommendation for David to define hedonic principles and set points, perhaps for some of our viewers who aren't as familiar with the concept. We've been discussing them in the course of conversation, but the idea is people tend to have default hedonic set points to which their moods revert in the absence of significant stimuli to the contrary. But David, you would be able to speak to this in much greater detail.
Yeah, so in the hedonic treadmill is essentially the set of negative feedback mechanisms in the central nervous system that stop most of us being very happy or very unhappy indefinitely. And it's most strikingly conveyed by this experiment study, lottery paradox, that 6 months after either winning the lottery or having a terrible accident that leaves you quadriplegic, most people were found to have reverted to their default level of well-being or ill-being before the great win or the tragedy. And very counterintuitive. Now, there are lots of complications here. For example, sustained uncontrollable stress can actually depress hedonic set point. But nonetheless, there is no real evidence that most people today are, on average, happier or unhappier than our ancestors on the African savannah. And most of the touted ways, environmental manipulation, improving a material environment, vast increase in living standards, don't on the whole seem to make a radical difference to hedonic set point. And one can see the evolutionary rationale for this. Essentially, it is highly adaptive to be discontented a lot of the time, always wanting more rather than counting your blessings. A couple of other terms that are just useful. Hedonic zero is emotionally neutral experience. That is neither good nor bad. It's what Sidgwick called the natural watershed. And most people, it seems, statistically spend, if they're relatively fortunate, most of their lives a little bit above hedonic zero. But tragically, hundreds of millions of people spend much of their lives below hedonic zero. And at the Darwinian extreme, there are a minority of people who essentially extraordinarily cheerful and optimistic by Darwinian standards. They can enjoy 6, 7, and 8 for most of their lives. Other people, sadly, endure chronic depression. And the idea behind hedonic uplift and the kind of biohappiness revolution isn't to maximize bliss, which is a recipe for idiocy, for good or bad, but instead ratchet up hedonic range and hedonic set points so that essentially you can, if you're a transhuman, that you can go through your life animated by information sensitive gradients of bliss. And the information sensitivity is absolutely critical, because it means you can behave in a socially responsible way, preserve critical insights, social responsibility, personal growth. You can retain your core values and preferences. It's, in one sense, it's revolutionary, but at least optionally, it's conservative too. It doesn't involve hedonic uplift for everyone. It doesn't involve, let's say, the ruling elite imposing their preferences and values on others. And this is going to be technically feasible later this century and beyond. How far, it's possible to go. I sometimes talk of a future civilization with a hedonic range of, let's say, plus 70 to a plus 100. I could say plus 90 to a plus 100. This is schematic, but this emphasizes that in principle, at any rate, one can have tremendous hedonic diversity, but nonetheless, a civilization whose absolute hedonic depths are plus 70, nonetheless, their worst experiences are far richer than our peak experiences, and mastery of our reward circuitry is going to allow such hedonic engineering. quite what's, I can say words like super happiness, superhuman bliss, and so forth. They're largely empty. But yeah, conjure up your most wonderful fantasy. The default can in principle be so much higher. I said personally, I'm a negative utilitarian. I think our overriding obligation is to minimize, mitigate, and prevent suffering. But what then? Should we simply be satisfied with a mediocre life in which there is no pain or suffering? Or should we aim to have a glorious transhuman, post-human civilization? And though by temperament I'm a super pessimist about life and reality and virtually everything, for technical reasons, yeah, I think the future is going to be sublime, glorious beyond anything we can imagine.
Yes, this is quite fascinating. And it's interesting to consider the role that certain kinds of suffering or suboptimal perceptions have had evolutionarily. Pain, for instance. Pain is an indicator of danger. It's an indicator that there might be a risk of injury, or there might be a risk of death if one continues to remain in a certain situation. However, there is a kind of maladaptive nature to pain, in the sense that there are actions that one could take to resolve a health problem that in the default state lead to tremendous pain. Virtually any surgery without anesthesia leads to tremendous pain, to the point that prior to the advent of anesthesia, many patients did choose to die rather than have certain life-saving surgeries performed on them. And anesthesia helped dial down that pain to the point where it was manageable or not perceived for the duration of the surgery, and that enabled the life-saving procedure to be performed. On the other hand, there are people who don't have pain receptors today, who actually have a hard time interacting with the external world. So if they don't perceive pain at all, they could touch a hot skillet and not feel much, but their skin is burning, so they get damaged. So what would you say is kind of the golden mean in terms of where these sensations ought to be, that they serve the useful signaling mechanism, but they don't prevent the actual responses that could solve the underlying problem?
Yes, there are hundreds of different genes and thousands of different alleles involved in some way or other in pain perception. But the SCN9A gene has been described as the so-called volume knob for pain. And rare nonsense mutations of SCN9A lead to congenital insensitivity to pain. And someone with such a mutation in the ancestral environment would die. Today, they need to lead a kind of cotton wool existence. And so, but SCN9A has dozens of other mutations. And what I think we ought to be aiming for is ensuring that all new children, and as autosomal gene therapy becomes available, existing people to have benign versions of SCN9A, so that the signaling function of raw fields of pain is retained, but nonetheless you enjoy the same pain tolerance of today's outliers. As well as people with congenital insensitivity to pain, there are a number of other syndromes, Marsilli syndrome, but also, and this has been in the news a bit, last year, I don't know to what extent in the USA, Joe Cameron. Joe Cameron, a retired 72-year-old vegan Scottish school teacher. She has a couple of unusual mutations of the so-called far and far out genes, and she has unusually high levels of anandamide, this endogenous cannabinoid, anandamide being from the Sanskrit to bliss. And for her, she thought she was normal, but she went through childbirth, for example. She describes it as like a tickle. And I'm told by women who have undergone childbirth without proper anesthesia that yes, it's a lot worse for most people than that. But she had Jo has lived a normal life. I said as a schools teacher, pillar of the local community. Yes, in retrospect, yes, she realized, she waved away anesthetics and painkillers. She came to the attention of the medical authorities as a result of operation on her hand that doctor expected was going to be excruciatingly painful, but she waved away any kind of analgesics. Yeah, a lot of research needs to be done there, but it's Jo never gets depressed or anxious. Her pain threshold is exceptionally high. She lives a normal life. She is incredibly ordinary, not a kind of a vision of some transhumanist super person or anything, reassuringly normal, and yet her quality of life is vastly greater than most people today. Now, should everyone have this unique or nearly unique dual mutation? I think it's premature to suggest this because, to use a rather crude example, men tend to take far more risks than women for evolutionary reasons. And although Jo lives in the Scottish Highlands, whereas a typical rough and tumble youngster, adventurous, risk-taking, and so on, would probably, with her condition, do himself significant harm. But it's an example of the kind of choice that we're going to be able to make as a society and a civilization. How much of the raw feels of low mood, anxiety, pain do we want? Liz, I got a text message flashed up. What is the link between, so I missed the precise wording, between mood and empathy? And I think this is a question quite a lot of people worry about. If we are going to radically ratchet up hedonic range, isn't there a risk of ceasing to feel compassion, empathy for the suffering of others? It's a real problem, but it's worth, I think it's very instructive, the drug MDMA or ecstasy. Now, sadly, MDMA, ecstasy, is potentially neurotoxic, and it's not the solution that I'm going to recommend, but nonetheless, it is a pointer to the future. MDMA is a euphoriant, but it's also an empathogen. It gives people a tremendous desire. It fills people with love, empathy, compassion for themselves and others. It tends to diminish or even completely abolish jealousy. It shows it's possible to be extraordinarily happy and yet at the same time extraordinarily empathetic and loving. Someone who is on MDMA is extremely vulnerable because they are so full of love and compassion for others. Now, that sounds as though, well, MDMA, wonder drug. Unfortunately, its effects, peak effects, only lasts about 90 minutes or so. The hedonic treadmill kicks in. MDMA is potentially neurotoxic. The next week, some users report the kind of subtle, long, drawn-out opposite of the empathetic effects. MDMA is not the wonder drug we're looking for, but nonetheless, I think it provides important clues for what is going to be possible in future, that I very much hope it's going to be possible to design sustainable, empathetic euphorians. But better than any drug, why not address the biological genetic heart of the problem. But yeah, that is much more ambitious. How does MDMA work? It's not adequately understood because the mind brain isn't well understood, but the three neurotransmitters involved are serotonin, dopamine, and critically oxytocin. And yeah, the release of these three neurotransmitters in conjunction induces this state of empathetic euphoria. People on MDMA are tremendously emotionally honest with each other. It's yeah, it's been used as a tool in therapy, and it's, you know, it's extremely cruel, the fact that one can't responsibly advocate its wider use, because, as I said, it is potentially neurotoxic, and rather than dismantling the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain, it just tends to kick them in with a vengeance.
Yes, indeed. And it's interesting, too, that there are a fairly narrow range of substances that can be consumed in a way that might have positive mental effects, but also would not have dangerous physical side effects. And that's the challenge of our, let's say, insufficiently advanced level of scientific knowledge and ability to fabricate substances that do precisely what we want them to do and don't have these deleterious side effects that might be dangerous to health and longevity. Now, it's interesting too, we mentioned a lot of non-pharmacological ways to improve mood, to improve cognitive functioning. Sleep and exercise were mentioned, but also art has a role. And art can provide visions of a world that is in some ways improved from our own, or more interesting in certain respects. You have artists going back to the ancient world that depicted fascinating landscapes and structures and interesting creatures. And of course, there are futurist artists like Robert McCall from the late 20th, early 21st century, who envisioned all of these wonderful cityscapes and planetary settlements, and I think inspired a generation of transhumanists. And along these lines, we have a question from one of our viewers in Russia. To you, David, what pieces of art do you know and could recommend that would convey this vision of paradise engineering, where suffering in significant ways is eradicated from the world? What would that world look like? Do you know of any artists who depict that with great skill?
Good heavens. I mean, and I would appreciate Caspar David Friedrich, for example. But I'm torn because, yes, I think a lot of people have their most beautiful, sometimes even sublime experiences with nature, and could, yeah, appreciate whether it's a wildlife documentary or a work of great art just showing the beauties of nature. Yet nature, you know, proverbially kind of red and tooth and claw, is actually an extremely cruel and sinister place. So yeah, I'm ambivalent about some of the, shall we say, the rewarding aesthetic experiences I have, because I enjoy, yeah, looking at pictures of cute, fluffy, vegetarian, herbivorous animals. I enjoy both art and sometimes, yes, sort of communing with nature. And yet at the same time, this, yeah, this idyllic conception of nature, it's simply not tenable. In terms of, yeah, what is the future of arts? I think some critics say that transhumanism perhaps is a recipe for us to all become kind of crass Philistines. But what will be possible is to identify the molecular signature of beauty, of aesthetic experience in the brain, and massively purify, enrich, and amplify it. So if we want to, we can, we'll be able to ensure that everyday life is more sublimely, gloriously beautiful than anything that existing artists can evoke. So yeah, that's going to be one option for the future. But yeah, unfortunately, in terms of paradise engineering today, yeah, I mean, I could talk about my personal vision of paradise, but like other people's dreams, it wouldn't come alive for most people. So if so, when trying to imagine a future of paradise engineering, I would generally ask someone to conjure up their personal, perhaps very private version of paradise, their fondest memory or their ideal fantasy. And yeah, essentially, if we're prepared to intervene with our reward circuitry, then life could be immeasurably better. But in terms of shortcuts, sadly, today's existing drugs do not provide that shortcut. They simply activate the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain, which is cruel. But yeah, it's just the way it is, unfortunately.
Yes, indeed. And on the subject of cultivating one's own aesthetic vision of what that future world might look like, Edward Hudgens writes, quote, "I notice Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars on my evening jog, and the moon when it's out, a great physical and aesthetic mix." And it's interesting too, in the transhumanist community, there's a lot of planetary art, a lot of spacescapes that people admire. And of course, that dovetails with a vision of human space colonization and exploration and settlement. So that inspires a lot of people, and that's just one potential vision. Another vision would be futuristic cityscapes. Another vision would be some sort of world that doesn't have the red and tooth and claw aspects of nature. I'm even thinking of some of these paintings that have been created for a humorous purpose. Like if you have anthropomorphized dogs and cats and mice sitting by a table and drinking tea, well, perhaps in a future era that might be possible if they're uplifted and any of their carnivorous desires are engineered out of them. We might get to a point where they're all sitting around a table drinking tea, and we might be sitting around the table too, conversing with them.
Yeah, that's going to be possible too. And this is one advantage, particularly with a traditional or religious audience. One starts from the Bible and Isaiah and the peaceable kingdom and the lion and the wolf lying down with the lamb. Yeah, if one wants to get an audience on one side and it's a traditional audience, yeah, invoke one of the ancients, whether Buddha or Jesus or the Bible or something, because yeah, I mean, clearly the Bible doesn't go into any of the technical details of how we can engineer a world where the lion and the wolf can lie down with the lamb, but yeah, it's going to be possible. Yeah, a compassionate ecosystem. People's first reaction, if you talk about it, is it sounds ecologically illiterate, stupid philosophers kind of thing. But yeah, if we are prepared to use cross-species fertility regulation, whether immunocontraception or tunable gene drives, and we're prepared to convert today's obligate carnivores into herbivores, which can be done. I mean, initially, one will perhaps use sort of catnip laced cultured mincemeat or something, but yeah, a few genetic tweaks, and you can have a world where the lion and the wolf lie down with the lamb. To which species essentialists say that a lion that isn't asphyxiating zebras and doing that kind of stuff isn't truly a lion. But yeah, are humans who stop harming non-human animals and start wearing clothes and starting to use iPhones and so forth, are we truly human? And if not, does it matter? Yeah, the world needs civilizing. And there's a difference between, on the one hand, there is being completely wild, and there's on another extreme, it's being incarcerated, turning the whole living world into a zoo. But there's a happy medium of being free living, and humans tend to flourish best when we're neither completely wild, nor of course when we're incarcerated, but when we're free to go about our business with decent healthcare, accommodation, nutrition, bit of law, bit of law and order. And yeah, I think it's likely that we're going to civilize the rest of the living world too.
Excellent. And Zach Richardson in the comments exclaims that we might train a lion to eat tofu. That would be an interesting day when that happens. But I wanted to make sure that Pavel and Art Ramon had the opportunity to ask questions or make comments, and then we'll get to more of the audience questions.
Sure. Yeah, David, you probably heard this question a million times, but I still want to ask. Let's assume we achieve super happiness and that we give the sentient beings this pleasure and happiness button, which they can press and feel whatever euphoria. Or you can imagine future where AI monitor our endorphins level in our brain, and when it's see abnormalities, it just inject more to keep us in this euphoric state. Would it be just starve to death, or don't do anything but keep pressing the pleasure button? And the second question, it's about, and especially it's important in the context of the US elections, what are your thoughts about othering and how to overcome it? And it's also applied to transhumanist communities. There's lots of othering among transhumanists. So what are your thoughts on that?
Two quite different questions. Yeah, not related, but back in 1954, Olds and Milner discovered what were then called the pleasure centers, and they discovered that a rat or a monkey or a whole host of other creatures would, if given the opportunity to self-stimulate their mesolimbic dopamine system, would do so indefinitely in preference to food or sex, and wireheading doesn't show tolerance. Big complication is that it now seems intracranial self-stimulation of the mesolimbic dopamine pathways is actually activating desire, the anticipation of pleasure, rather than pure bliss. But as a basic concept, yeah, once we actually decipher the molecular signature of bliss, solve the binding problem, is it possible that essentially people are going to want to just enjoy pure, exquisite rapture indefinitely, instead of 10-second orgasms, 3-week, 3-month, 300-year orgasms? And yes, it's possible, but one needs to consider the nature of selection pressure, in that wireheads or their pharmacological equivalent don't want to raise baby wireheads, whereas someone who, even if their hedonic set point and hedonic range is vastly higher, someone who chooses to retain critical insight, intelligence, who instead of going for maximum bliss chooses to be socially responsible, they are going to more likely to maximize the inclusive fitness of their genes than wireheads, crudely. So yeah, one has to consider selection pressure. Much more could be said there, of course. Okay, this question of othering, how can, if I've understood you correctly, how can one build an inclusive sense of us that embraces not merely one's fellow Democrats or Republicans, but all Americans, all citizens of the world, or, and this is what I favor,
I would
an
extend it
inclusive
to all sentient beings.
I was going to, yes, exactly. An inclusive sense of us or we that embraces all sentient beings. And it's an immense challenge. I mean, one can start going into heavy duty philosophical issues, open, closed, empty individualism or anything like that. But most people are not temperamental philosophers. In general, I sometimes, this is the rather grand name for it, invoke the principle of weak benevolence, which just another way of saying, well, an informal way of putting it, no skin off my nose, is that if we focus on ways to improve everyone's quality of life, human and non-human, that doesn't involve personal sacrifice or inconvenience, most people will go along with it. Most people are not systematically malicious or malevolent. And this is the wonderful thing about what can broadly be described as transhumanist technologies, but in particular, technologies that will amplify, enrich our reward system, is that they don't need to be rationed. The substrates of bliss aren't like, great works of art or something that, finite in number. Though this falls a long way short of thinking of us as all sentients, nonetheless, so long as we can develop technologies that can benefit all sentient beings, I think they are likely to be adopted. But in terms of, what kind of timescale are we talking about? In terms of, let's say, American politics, there is no obvious short-term way that one can resolve some of the differences in American politics. But by ratcheting up hedonic range and set points, one can dodge the issue of these thorny, irreconcilable issues. Or, something like, how are we going to solve the problems of the Middle East? Multiple conflicting preferences. I don't know, but I do know how we can raise everyone's hedonic set points and hedonic range. And that's what I would see as a distinctively transhumanist approach, aiming to dodge the problem of irreconcilable preferences. Looking further ahead, I can see it's going to be possible to use technologies of reversible thalamic bridges so that it will be possible to do partial mind melding. As one unique example today of the Hogan sisters, conjoined twins who one body, two heads, but they share a thalamic bridge. So in some sense, they can partially experience each other's thoughts and feelings. And in future, it should be possible for us to do the functional equivalent. So we can reversibly mind meld with each other. And if, and this is looking much further into the future, if we live in a society in which mind melding is possible, it's not quite the Borg, but nonetheless, we would see that harming another sentient being is akin to harming oneself. Whether the long-term future lies in a kind of single collective hive mind or partial and reversible mind melding, like today, as I mentioned the example of the Hogan sisters, or if instead we're pretty much gonna live, each of us, in our solipsistic island universes, communicating with each other but still being pretty metaphysically apart. I don't know, but yeah, if it is possible to use something like reversible thalamic bridges, yeah, our concept of otherness will change. And one aspect of this revolution, it won't just be a moral revolution. If we could routinely mind meld, there will also be a revolution in the nature of decision theoretic rationality. There is a technically excellent, less wrong decision theoretic fact that anyone can check out, but it assumes the perspective of metaphysical individualism. But I mean, I would like to see, and perhaps I will I will try to write, but I've procrastinated so far. It will also be possible to do a, shall we say, a God's eye decision theoretic fact, a kind of offering. It sounds almost too good to be true. The idea that morality and decision theoretic rationality could converge. But ultimately, yeah, I think the egocentric illusion is an illusion. And yeah, sure, I seem to be special. It's extremely adaptive, fitness enhancing to think of oneself as the kind of hub of reality that follows one around. But intellectually, one knows one isn't really the center of the universe. And technology can help us overcome this, perhaps initially with a kind of naturalized telepathy, but maybe in future even reversible mind melding.
Now, there is a follow-up question on this from Zach Richardson, who asks, do you think you could mind meld with a person, but still wall off parts of your thoughts from them, your deep, dark secrets or embarrassing events and memories? And I am thinking of this too in terms of the future of brain-computer interfaces, how it may be possible to share certain perceptions or data about one's thoughts with another individual, but there is this risk of a complete meld and a kind of dissolving of individuality. So just like we are concerned about our data privacy online, we want to select what we share and what we keep to ourselves. Similarly, it would seem reasonable to be concerned about if one is directly connected to another person's mind, what we share, what we keep to ourselves, and how can we viably disconnect and still remain ourselves while that other person remains a separate person, so that we don't just become some singular hive mind that is inextricably intertwined.
Yes, I mean, complete radical honesty, let alone partial mind melding, would be an absolute disaster today. Civilization depends, sadly, on deception, lies. Not all of it is nasty. A lot of the deceit involved in social interaction is simply to lubricate everyday existence. But yeah, before contemplating anything as radical as reversible thalamic bridges, we're going to need to beautify our minds. Now, we mentioned a bit earlier MDMA or ecstasy, partly as a consequence of the copious amounts of oxytocin released. People on MDMA are extremely honest with each other, tell each other things they couldn't imagine sharing with another sentient being. But this is potentially very dangerous in a Darwinian world. So yeah, before contemplating mind melding or partial mind melding or reversible mind melding or any form of naturalized telepathy, yeah, we need to upgrade our minds. And yeah, for evolutionary reasons, Darwinian minds are extraordinarily nasty and dark, or at least some of them for some of the time. So yeah, there are hazards here.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, David. And this is one reason why privacy is so important, so that individuals can present those aspects of their thinking and their intention, which are conducive to cooperation and benevolent interaction with others. But if they feel something like unjustified anger, perhaps they should have the option to keep that back. And I always say this is a choice that individuals have. They could feel something, but they have a choice to act on it or not. And by choosing not to act on a negative emotion, they're helping society move in a more reasonable, more decent direction. Now, I'm curious, Art Ramon, if you have questions or comments for David.
Yes, how do you feel about insect and worm farming as a short-term solution to what you're planning?
Insect and worm farming. Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, negative as an ethical negative utilitarian. This sounds odd, but I think it's much wiser to advocate a kind of high-tech Jainism that preserves, aims to uphold and enshrine in law the sanctity of life. Because sure, insects and worms, their cephalic ganglia, they are very humble minds, but nonetheless, they are individual subjects of experience. They should be wantonly harmed. And if that sounds ridiculous, as it does to many people, it's perhaps worth considering that compared to post-human superintelligence, we are akin to insects and worms. Now, yeah, if we were obligate carnivores and there were no cultured meat or anything, and it was a life and death matter, yes, it would be preferable to eat worms and insects rather than harm pigs, sheep, or chickens. But the fact is that it's possible, well, as we know, that the dietary traditions of the Indian subcontinent are vegetarian or quasi-vegan. Everyone can be a vegetarian today. Most people can be a vegan. And so, yeah, although I can see why, yeah, I mean, it has been discussed, yeah, the possibility of insect and worm farming. I don't think this is a solution. I think we should err on the side of caution, that our goal should be systematically helping sentient beings, not harming them.
And this is an interesting perspective. Now, I've gotten to the point where I'm actually quite reluctant to kill insects anymore. So if I see some sort of spider or beetle that I know to be harmless, as long as I believe it's not posing a threat to me, it's just in the wrong place at the wrong time, I will actually take a paper towel and evict it from my house rather than killing it. On the other hand, I have no compunction about killing ants. I had a situation in my house where there was an ant colony, and an exterminator went around and sprayed a chemical substance around the house, thinking it would form a barrier for the ants from entering. But what happened was it formed a barrier for the ants from leaving. And so they were ravenous for food, and they had no choice but to go into my kitchen and kind of swarm the cupboards, the lining of the doors of the refrigerator. And I had to stand there with a vacuum cleaner, essentially getting rid of these ants for a couple of weeks until I essentially placed some ant gel, poisonous ant gel, that they took back to their nest, and it finally ended the problem. But I recall perhaps personally killing about 15,000 ants during that process. And it seems to me the extent of the compassion that one can show for a very different life form kind of also depends on the context in which one is placed. I mean, these ants, they wouldn't have killed me. They wouldn't have even poisoned my food. and yet they were there as just this extreme nuisance invading my space. Would you say there's a room in a rational person's mind in those kinds of cases to respond with force and destruction against what is a kind of invasion rather than just killing something for convenience?
Yeah, I mean, this is it. Life, as we all know, is extraordinarily messy, and although one can, a saintly piety is about high-tech Jainism, in practice, yeah, one is in the course of a lifetime going to harm directly or indirectly all sorts of sentient beings, from treading on an ant to scenarios such as you describe, to swarms of locusts, devouring crops, which is why rather than individual, ad hoc responses, I think really one needs a global strategy for a happy biosphere, and which is going to call for a revolution, moral revolution. When it's going to happen, I don't know. But yeah, we can use genetic engineering and synthetic gene drives. Gene drives cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance, so one can spread desired mutations across an entire species, sexually reproducing species, at even if the mutation in question naively impairs the fitness of the individual. They're initially going to be used to defeat vector-borne disease, but they can be used for any other purpose we choose. Yeah, I think we need a coordinated strategy to decide what kinds of organism we want to preserve and which we want non-violently to retire. And before embarking on some crazy scheme to re-engineer the entire global ecosystem, one will start with self-contained artificial biospheres and be able to, having a kind of low pain miniature biosphere. In the meantime, in the course of a lifetime, all kinds of messy dilemmas of the kind you describe. I would be extremely alarmed if I saw someone, deliberately treading on an ant or a beetle, as much for the implications, this coarsening and brutalizing effects on how they will behave to, let's say, a sheep or a chicken or a pig or another human. But equally, though as a 4-year-old child, I used to rescue worms and ants. These days, if I were to discover that I had inadvertently trodden on and killed an ant, although not pleased, I wouldn't be traumatized by it. It's
Yes, indeed, and that is quite sensible. I think sometimes it's a question of what one's mindset is when one engages in such actions. As you mentioned, accidentally killing an ant, it's not great, but it's not morally reprehensible. Deliberately killing anything seems to, of course, result in a different state of mind and a different impression regarding one's state of mind. But I would point out also a lot of people who are not vegetarian themselves would never personally kill an animal. So the reason why they are meat eaters is not that they enjoy the killing, it's that they feel they're sufficiently removed from the killing. Like, these animals are being killed anyway, and they're being killed on such a mass scale that an individual's consumption decisions are not going to change that. On the other hand, with lab-grown meat, cultured meat, they might get the identical products without the animal death. And I think that probably is going to be the most persuasive factor in any decision at a society-wide level to move away from factory farming or move away from slaughterhouses. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I very much hope that the US Transhumanist Party makes us, a very kind of prominent plank of its program, the accelerated development and commercialization of cultured meat, because I think once the revolution starts, I think there's probably going to be a lot of virtue signaling too, but if you have two identical products, one is they really, identical text, texture, it is meat. One is cruelty free, the other is slaughtered non-human animal. Any decent person is going to go for the cruelty free option. So then, essentially, I think factory farms will be shut and outlawed, and there'll be a moral revolution as well as a dietary revolution. But it's the moralist in me wants to say that, look, what we're doing is unbelievably frightful. How are we going to explain it to our grandchildren? But one needs to be politically, socially realistic, and so yes, developing meat substitutes and cultured meat, I think, is imperative.
Yes, indeed. So now let us move to a few more audience questions. First of all, Daniel Twet has an interesting question. Do you think optimism is a necessary prerequisite for transhumanism? And he put in parentheses, I tend to think so. And yet you described yourself as someone who is by default inclined to pessimism. So with regard to how optimism and transhumanism interrelate, I would be particularly interested to hear your perspective.
Yes, okay. First, you must forgive me. I forgot the point I wanted to make about cultured meat. It will avoid catastrophic pandemics like COVID. Goodness knows how much is the financial cost of the current pandemic, let alone the suffering. But though the precise origins of the pandemic are still speculative, if we get rid of animal agriculture, humans will benefit massively too. So forgive me for just interjecting that before tackling the question of optimism. Do transhumanists need to be optimists? I think effective transhumanists will be optimists. That one needs to be. As I said, I'm unusual. I'm very pessimistic by temperament. I mean, the fancy term is depressive realism, and that by some quite objective indices, pessimists tend to, their judgment can be more accurate. But in terms of actually getting things done, it's vital to be, insofar as is possible, positive, optimistic, even unreasonably so. What one wants to do is to retain the functional analogues of depressive realism without the kind of learned helplessness and behavioral despair of depression, because I would have been skeptical about the wheel kind of thing, but I don't know. I mean, if you look at all the people in history who seem to have done worthwhile things, fundamentally they seem to have been optimists, or at least bipolar. That unipolar depression, low mood, essentially, sadly, people who are unipolar depressives don't tend to do great things. Transhuman. That's sorry, I'm rambling slightly, but an optimistic frame of mind is pretty essential to getting things done, as distinct from talking about getting things done.
This is interesting. Do you think it might be possible to have a kind of optimistic frame of mind in the abstract while having a more negative hedonic set point? Like from the standpoint of a philosophical conviction, one believes that these great things are possible, and one believes there are certain steps that humankind can take to achieve them. On the other hand, one doesn't necessarily feel euphoria when one gets up in the morning. One just feels, okay, now I have to go about my day and do things, but in the abstract, I recognize that doing them is worthwhile.
Yeah, known biases can be corrected for. What one can't correct for is the unknown unknowns, just simple ignorance. And yeah, whether it's individuals or if one is programming the functional analogs of depressive realism into a computer. Yeah, sorry, I haven't got any really incisive, off-the-shelf answer here. But yeah, empirically, it is the case that most transhumanists are optimists. There are a few pessimists, but not many. But having said that, even though most transhumanists are optimists, you might think, well, the optimists are more likely to engage in risky behaviors. But this doesn't follow at all. Generally, the more you love life, the more you want to protect and preserve it. Whereas depressive people may be more prone to self-neglect or engage in risky behaviors. At the extreme, of course, one gets the tragedy of self-harm and even suicide. And one, for better or worse, by tackling the problem of suffering, one will also, in practice, I suspect, minimize and mitigate existential and global catastrophic risk. They tend to be seen as quite orthogonal. There are futurists who work on the problem of existential risks, and there are a smaller number who particularly focused on the problem of suffering. But yeah, essentially, I think we want to engineer a population of fanatical life lovers.
Yes, indeed. And I'm often faced with this question, well, aren't you so focused on pursuing life extension because you fear death? And my answer is twofold. First of all, what rational person doesn't fear death? And why is that necessarily bad? And second, it is that more fundamental than fearing death is loving life. One cannot really fear the loss of something that one doesn't value in the first place. And then again, that gets back to, why is fear a bad thing if life is good and you want to keep on living?
Very much agreed, yes.
Yes, indeed. So now I think it would be a good time to venture into some of the political conversations, especially as we brought up previously in the Salon. This is an extremely divisive time for American politics because of this polarization between right and left. And the US Transhumanist Party has offered a different vision, not left-wing, not right-wing, but upwing. And we've had even commentators in the chat point out that really this is a vision that should appeal across partisan lines in the United States. This was a comment from Edward Hudgens, and Daniel Twett recommended that every political party should have a transhumanist caucus. So ultimately, questions of the impact of science and technology on the future of humankind, on the ability to solve some of the massive problems facing our species right now, should not be matters of right-wing versus left-wing policies. There should be significant areas of agreement across the contemporary political spectrum. So what are some of your thoughts about how that recognition can be elicited from the general public, and what that could do to help heal some of these current divisions.
Goodness. How can I fix American politics? But what does the term socialism conjure up? I mean, it's a boo word for a lot of Americans. And one of the great tragedies, I think, is the way that the Soviet experiment polluted the entire language of social justice. And yeah, if one knows Scandinavian countries, for example, and to a lesser extent the UK, essentially we want to live in a society. Realistically, it's going to be a mixed economy in which there is universal access to healthcare, basic healthcare, universal basic income, access to medicine, healthcare, and decent housing and shelter. Essentially some version of the mixed economy. And it's a tragedy if this is reduced to some kind of left-right issue. As you know, plenty of right-wing theorists have made the case for universal basic income. It means that the last kind of welfare bureaucracy can be dismantled. Universal access to healthcare, essentially it's likely to benefit everyone, society as a whole. But I mean, one thing I've tried to avoid doing in my writing is, setting out my blueprint, my own social political blueprints, because a lot of these issues are intractable. At the same time, having said that, simply invoking recalibrating the hedonic treadmill, it's not a five-year plan. I would like to think that I, transcend something as archaic as the left-right divide, but I've discovered, much to my shock, that I don't live in quite the filter bubble I'd imagine. On Facebook, I find some of my Facebook friends articulating views that I assumed had disappeared the last century, and it's profoundly disconcerting to me. So sorry for not having an incisive list, a 5-point plan to sort out American politics, but it's pretty intractable. I hadn't realized, perhaps naively, the extent to which race is still a factor in American politics. I can now come up with a whole bunch of superficial generalities that probably wouldn't help much.
It's interesting because I'm in a similar situation to yours with regard to which attitudes surprised me. And living in the United States, circa 2010, I thought the US was a post-racial society because I thought, look, the United States had elected a Black president, slavery is long over, segregation is long over, we interact with people of different skin colors, different national origins all the time. We seem to be civil and cordial to one another. And then around the middle of the last decade, various factors changed that gave rise to a very different impression. On the other hand, there was this kind of rise of racialized identity politics on the left, but also a kind of rise of nativist populism on the right. And one had very strident demonstrations, expressions of views that I thought were long obsolete, because I thought we had at least figured out not to use those kinds of superficial characteristics as distinguishing factors among human beings. And of course, there were other problems too, like the problem of police violence in the United States, which is unique among the countries of the Western world, in that, for instance, the UK doesn't have that rate of police killings of anybody nearly to the same extent. So there was this mix of issues kind of simmering under the surface that a lot of us became aware of about 5-6 years ago, and that have intensified since then. And on the other hand, you pointed out this filter bubble effect, where people, especially on social media, they tend to associate with those who are similar to them in certain respects. And when they come into contact with another filter bubble universe, like the bubbles kind of approach one another and meld a little bit through the exteriors, and you peer into the other bubble and you're quite astonished at what is over there, because it's been evolving in isolation. How to overcome that? I mean, the internet is supposed to have created this cosmopolitan culture of abundant information and knowledge sharing and opportunities for improvement. And there are such vast educational resources out there that people who want to get a more realistic picture of the world can do that. It seems time is a limiting factor, but there are other cognitive biases as well that are limiting factors. But what can be done to at least reverse that dynamic so that it moves in a more positive and enlightening direction for all?
I'm hoping someone is going to offer an incisive answer here. And at times I'm prone to sound like a crude genetic determinist, but yeah, tweaking this or that gene or upgrading our reward circuitry is going to solve all our problems. But as well as the biological genetic, yes, we need to tackle a whole host of political issues. Yeah, what I don't want to do, it's just so easy to come up with a whole bunch of platitudes, which, though they sound fine, are actually not going to fundamentally solve the problem. In terms of the future, this is much more controversial. I am pessimistic about our prospects of avoiding catastrophic nuclear war this century. Although, as you probably may guess, I am not a great fan of Donald Trump. His redeeming feature as a president, and this is not trivial, is he wants to win. He wanted to win the Nobel Peace Prize because Obama did. He's not embroiled America in any wars, and essentially nature designed human male primates to hunt and wage war against other coalitions of male primates. And if we go in our current trajectory, essentially, nuclear weapons are going to be used in armed conflict, whether it's so-called local nuclear war or theater or global war. And if you think 2020 has been a bad year, and it has, it scarcely bears thinking about the nature of conflict involving thermonuclear weapons. So I would like this is it. What is the solution in the long run? This is highly controversial. I would like to see some kind of democratically elected United Nations or world government. The downside are obvious. The downsides are obvious. One imagines some kind of totalitarian world state. But nationalism has been responsible for most of the wars of the past 200 years. And hundreds and possibly thousands of millions of people are on our current trajectory likely to die this century in war unless we actually tackle the problem. Because anyway, I could go on in a rather pessimistic vein. I'm not at all optimistic about our chances of avoiding war of the century, whether it's in the Middle East or India and Pakistan or the Koreas, or God forbid, blundering into some conflict with China.
And interestingly enough, I agree with you that nuclear war poses the single greatest existential risk to humankind right now because of the continued prevalence of nuclear weapons and the fact that under Donald Trump, the direction has been reversed, whereas prior to that time, there had been a major disarmament under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and then a kind of gradual dwindling of the nuclear stockpile. Donald Trump did reverse that, and Putin and Russia reversed that trajectory as well. So both great powers are building up their nuclear arsenal, and of course, China is doing the same now. And I agree with you, Donald Trump did have the redeeming feature that he did not directly drag the United States into significant foreign conflicts. But on the other hand, he did set the stage for greater risk of nuclear war going forward with the nuclear arms buildup that the US has engaged in. And the US Transhumanist Party goes so far as to say, we would like multilateral disarmament if possible, but we would support unilateral disarmament on behalf of the United States or any other country that wishes to undertake it, if that is necessary, if that is the only way. So my suggestion during a prior discussion with Jeffrey Ladish has been that the United States renounce all offensive nuclear capability and instead focus on developing extremely accurate and effective defense systems that would be able to intercept and neutralize nuclear weapons, preferably somewhere where there's no risk of fallout, like high up in the Earth's atmosphere. So what would you think would be the most viable policies or approaches toward reducing and hopefully eliminating the risk of nuclear warfare?
Yeah, good heavens. Difficult issues. One way to address the problem is, just as earlier touched on, the possibility of legislation to outlaw animal agriculture not kicking in now, but in 10 years' time. Though in the very near future, nuclear disarmament doesn't seem credible. If there can be some kind of global consensus that we should phase out nuclear weapons, then I think it should be explored. But unfortunately, as long as we have nation states that claim a monopoly of the use of force within their borders, I see war as probably inevitable, which is why I think that going for a democratically elected United Nations is perhaps our best hope of avoiding catastrophic war. Of course, the League of Nations and the United Nations were set up in the wake of terrible global conflict, and it may well be that some kind of world government only occurs in the wake of terrible nuclear war this century. But it would be a tremendous blessing if we could agree to cede sovereignty over the use of force to a democratically elected United Nations. Now, as I said, I have not explored this in depth. I'm not a political power player, mover and shaker. I suspect some transhumanists at least will strongly disagree. But but the question arises: how then are we seriously imagining that there isn't going to be war between nation states this century? And if they are medium-sized states, the war is likely to involve nuclear weapons.
Now, some have stated nuclear weapons could be a deterrent from all-out war, and this is the mutually assured destruction theory. I don't subscribe to it, but what do you say with regard to the notion that the reason why there hasn't been major warfare among conventional great powers in the 20th and early 21st centuries, between World War II and now, essentially, is that there was such fear of nuclear annihilation that the conflicts that did occur were a lot more restrained. Do you agree with that, or do you still see the risks as overwhelming the benefits, like the risk of an accident or a misinterpretation of the other side's intentions?
Yeah, and just as in 1914, many people could congratulate civilization on having avoided terrible, something like the Napoleonic Wars or anything. That civilization was clearly outgrowing something as primitive as war. And then well, we know what happened, and suddenly I think something analogous is going to happen with nuclear weapons, that we are sleepwalking our way to disaster. That how much faith should one place on the emotional, intellectual, moral stability, responsibility of a handful of power players? I don't think one can rely on that. I mean, China, for example, seems to have been in recent years pretty responsible, but Mao, for example, someone can probably dig up the exact quote to the effect saying that China could survive hundreds of millions of casualties and still emerge victorious. I mean, other ways to avoid catastrophic war are, if anything, even more utopian. I, once briefly discussed, the idea of all female governance, as has been. This point is not original to me. There's no instance of history of women, females banding together for the purposes of wars of territorial aggression. I mean, chimpanzees, it's exactly the same. It's not part of the kind of behavioral phenotype of women. And that if, as a technical risk reduction measure, there was just a broad consensus for all female political governance, well, I think that would dramatically and probably eliminate the risk of catastrophic war. However, I don't seriously advocate this because it's utopian. I just don't sociologically think it's going to happen. So, as I said, the least worst option I can think of is world government. Certain problems like climate change, war and peace can only, I think, be solved at the supranational world level, just as some problems are best sorted out at the national or the parish level. And one wants to avoid slipping into kind of useless utopianism, and one way around this is legislating not for next year or even 5 years, but for 20, 30 years ahead, when it doesn't involve existing power players ceding their control.
Mm-hmm. And along the lines of resolving some of the societal tensions, Tom Ross made a comment stating one solution would be to make algorithms that unite as sophisticated as those that have placed us into these filter bubbles. So he is advocating a moonshot programming effort as effective as various troll farms have been, except in a more constructive direction. Tom, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that's what we've been experiencing here in the States. We've got enemy nation states that have purposely been dividing us. And I loved your analogy of the two bubbles coming together, where you can actually look into somebody else's. I've experienced that. People that I really respect, who I think are highly intelligent, have some very strange opinions and views and beliefs about my candidate and vice versa. And it just shows that we have been shepherded into very specific corrals by these algorithms, by our news feeds. And it's a very nefarious attempt by enemy nation states. And we know this, and it's worked, and it got really close to working again. So I think that's what we need to really become aware of. And if we had positive, uniting types of programmers working just as effectively on algorithms that are just as sophisticated as these are, to understand the nuance of somebody's big data, to understand the nuance that, sure, they may have these political leanings, but there is an opening here of common ground, or however that would play out. I think that's really important. I think we are all so ensconced in internet and our news feeds, and I woke up this morning, and the first thing I watched dictated how I was going to spend the morning, what I was going to be focused on. That happened to me yesterday too. I woke up and I saw the media was focusing on the whole white supremacist movement, and it amped me up to start writing a book about it. And we really do react to these algorithms that feed us. That was a little different because it's mass media, but there's news feeds that we get that are based on either things that we've watched or have shown a liking for, or have been fed to us to change our behavior in some nefarious way. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to be looking for really good-minded, good-natured, highly hedonistically dialed programmers to work against these things. That was the idea.
Great. I agree. Of course, the practicalities are daunting.
Yes. Now, Liz asks, do you think religion has a place in lifting hedonic state? And of course, a lot of transhumanists are not religious, myself included. Some are religious. There are Christian transhumanists, Mormon transhumanists, Buddhists who are transhumanists. So what do you think is the actual role of religion vis-a-vis states of the human mind? And could other aspects of life play similar roles without people necessarily having to accept a religious framework or worldview?
Well, earlier we touched on how possible to identify the molecular signatures of beauty in the brain and massively amplify them. Likewise, it'd be possible to use neuroscience and technology to identify the molecular signature of spiritual experience, massively enrich and amplify it, and create states of super spirituality that are far richer than anything physiologically feasible today. Now, question is, do these states of the divine, the spiritual, have some kind of transcendent meaning over and above their phenomenological properties? I mean, candidly, I'm a secular scientific rationalist, but having said that, science doesn't know how to crack the hard problem or the binding problem. Consciousness is an incredible mystery, and so the honest answer probably to say, simply don't know. In terms of providing meaning, it's true that religion has provided a sense of meaning and significance to countless lives. But let's say, sadly, someone, who is depressive, in many cases, they will be racked by guilt. In some religious traditions, they may feel that they're going to be tormented for all eternity in hell. Religion, though it can promote certain forms of well-being, meaning, and significance, can also cause a great deal of suffering too. And one of the many beauties of hedonic recalibration, life based on gradients of bliss, is that essentially it will solve the problem of meaning, the empirical problem of meaning. No one says, I feel blissfully happy, but my life feels empty and meaningless. And essentially the problem of of lives that are empty of meaning and significance will be solved by hedonic uplift. Whether transhumans, posthumans will occupy spiritual state spaces of consciousness, or whether instead we'll be profoundly secular, I don't know, but it's going to be technically optional. And even many religious people I know regret the fact that they undergo periods of spiritual dryness and emptiness, and in future this won't be necessary at all.
Yes, indeed.
Apologies, I'm going to take a pastels because I've been talking, so my throat is a little rough. Excuse me.
No problem. No problem. Now, I would like to spend a bit of time addressing the possibilities for transhumanist politics, because we have outlined some visions of a future that could be significantly better than our present, and we have also described some significant problems with contemporary policy, contemporary human attitudes toward politics, and the kinds of biases, filter bubbles, other problems that we have to overcome. And on the other hand, we have existential risks facing us too. So we have great promise, but great peril as well. And it seems that the ideas of transhumanism, if articulated in a way that reach major segments of the public, would be the counters to these risks and these perils. And yet transhumanism is still a relatively small movement. It doesn't have as widespread of name recognition among the general public, even though media and academia are picking up on it now. So what could be the role of a transhumanist political organization in this world that we find ourselves, and how can we as transhumanists, importantly, overcome the very human failings within our own selves and our own community to get to the point where we are an effective force for change in the world, and we're not hobbled by the limitations of humanity the way that most of humanity is hobbled today.
Oh, good heavens. Yeah, essentially, if transhumanists, there's two strategies. One is to hope that other political parties steal our clothes. And personally, I would be absolutely delighted if this happens. But is it possible that one day that a distinctively transhumanist party under the banner of transhumanism will gain political power? Yes, it's possible, but there are too many unknowns. As I said, personally, I am psychologically hopelessly ill-equipped to cope with politics. It requires extremely high social cognition, but also a combination of thick and thin skin. I have been, I'll be candid, completely blindsided by the whole Donald Trump phenomenon in American politics. I associated Republicans, for example, with primitive atavistic hostility towards Russia. And so, yeah, I have been surprised time and time again in recent years. In terms of the transhumanist movement, I'm afraid all I can offer is platitudes. I'm sorry, in terms of goodwill, friendship, but yeah, essentially we are, I must apologize, my voice is giving way, I've been talking too much. Essentially, we are still in many ways chimpanzees. Chimpanzees still, this is very crude generalization. They spend a lot of their time essentially squabbling, status seeking, mating, and making up. And one notices this in everything from animal rights to basically simply having a bunch of good ideas isn't enough by itself. And I have no idea how one can overcome human limitations other than just sound embarrassingly naive pleas for goodwill, tolerance, empathy, compassion, hearing the other perspective. I mean, this is it. It can sound embarrassingly trite. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you, David. I do think there is a lot that we can work with from what you just said, but to give you a few minutes to kind of regain your voice, why don't we go around to the other US Transhumanist Party panelists and see what their thoughts are on these kinds of more practical political questions with reference to some of the comments that David made earlier. And feel free in your remarks to be optimistic or pessimistic or balanced, however you're inclined to be in addressing this. So who wants to go first? How about Pavel, since we discussed tolerance and othering here as problems that we need to overcome?
I don't know if I can offer here more than David already offered, but yeah, we're still limited by our carriers, but our body, but our biological default settings, and the only thing we have is ability to hear, ability to listen, and ability to have a dialogue with one another. And you know, without the dialogue, it's impossible to build coalitions, build alliances, and find common ground. So I think I wish that USTP will use dialogue as much as possible to reach out to as much as people as possible and as diverse group of people as possible.
Yes, indeed. And I think we all share those hopes. Now, Liz, having been our vice presidential candidate, albeit for a briefer time period than we would have wanted to be the case, what would you say have been some takeaways from that experience and how they could relate to building up the potential for transhumanist politics going forward?
So why, we could subtitle this, why I'm not suing for a recount. Because I think that, you know, vastly, and thank you. I was really happy to be with you briefly for that. And I really hope to build the party up. I think that it's an essential, but I think that there's been a really good discussion here about the things that we would like to change if we could. Of course, we would like to have an elevated, you know, base state. I really am. I'm a super optimist. I'm a little bit lucky that way, although, and I'm still, you know, I find it an imperative, a daily imperative to work on things that make the world a better place. So I think that you can mix those. But I don't really think that that is our central core root problem. I think that we are really stuck in something called ego, and it's what David was talking about as being sort of still just primates, human primates. We are so, we have such a hard time getting close to other people for fear of involvement, for fear of, you know, rejection, really. And I think that that's a really sad place to be. So I think that as a species, we'll go much farther when we're more interconnected and less based in our ego and our own basic concerns. So as far as, you know, looking at political debate, we did a little bit of that. And we talked a little bit about how we saw the progress of the world going forward for the betterment of humans, not for the betterment of Liz Parrish or anyone else on this call. Although we would all then reap the benefits together. So yeah, I guess we all get something in the end. So, you know, I just think that we just have to be resilient, you know, when we listen to one another. Does everyone on this call agree with everything? No, we don't. But one thing that we can agree with is that the foresight to think of a better future helps us design that future. And that keeping an open mind to those different ideas are an imperative to add additional pieces to your puzzle that you're trying to personally solve. And us putting ego in the way, playing a football game with politics, you know, that it's my team against your team, and it's really not for the all over benefit of everyone. It's either that we don't believe that we can better society, which we actually have a whole history of doing that. So we should be able to believe that. Or it's because we're looking at short-term games. So of course, you know, the idea of the ability to have people consider that I might live a lot longer gives them the ability to expand their mind, that maybe they had better get along, that maybe we had better look out for this planet and the species on this incredible spaceship. I was out walking last night with my daughter. We call them walks of terror, because we used to do them when the kids were really little. If they wanted to go out walking at night, we'd turn off the flashlights and look at everything, and then look at the stars and go, oh, it's so scary, but it's so awesome. And we are so little. We are just hurtling through the universe on this spaceship that is just perfect. We have the perfect oxygen capsule. We have the perfect food sources. We've got the perfect entertainment. You can go climb a mountain. You can go down as deep as you can into the ditch of a Marianas Trench. I mean, why the ego is such a big thing in a conversation that is such a small, insignificant nothing to the universe is just, we could get so much farther without it. And I don't know. That's one thing that I would like to see us work through. And the thing that I learned about this is just, you know, respect, common respect for other people will get us so much farther. And listening and not knowing, I don't know, I'm just trying, you know, and making our best efforts to do that. So I'm not sure what that really says, but politics generally moving forward are going to have to be an open-minded process in which somehow we don't fear being hurt. We don't fear being wrong. I really don't know how we're going to change that besides just lay it all down. I don't know if we have to get to an ultimate low, like someone addicted to drugs, and they won't quit until they're at the ultimate low, when the planet is falling apart, things are on fire, things are freezing, we have nothing to eat. Why would we wait to that point? How could we be so intelligent and yet not able to do the most intelligent things, which is just to listen, learn, and build things? Look at the Burj Khalifa. Humans built that. If we can build that, we can do anything, you know. But the ego is stopping us from just basic general premises of basic ideas of bettering our neighbor. You know, somebody told me once that a compliment is hard to give. It's like exercising a muscle, and the more you do it, the easier it is to do, and pretty soon you get addicted to that long run that I know some people in this call like to do. And I think it's kind of essential. It's not, you know, it's going to be a multitude of things, and being part of this conversation and being part of the US Transhumanist Party really opened my mind to that, because I looked at politics in a really different way. If you take severe injury by the mere suggestion from someone else of something that you may not quite yet understand, you're really not for the future. You're a limited meat machine.
Yes, it seems all of the potential ingredients for this kind of uplifting transformation are here with us. As you mentioned, it is a matter of how we choose to harness them and what we choose to make of them. And indeed, sometimes the obstacles are within the human mind, within our evolved natures. Tom, what do you have to say about that?
Just nails it with the ego. The ego is the worst trait to bring to a problem-solving group of any kind. It blocks real solutions. Empathy is our superpower. When you have a group that is in an authentic state of empathy, and however you get them there, the ego leaves the room, and this unbelievable problem-solving capacity is unleashed when people are empathetic, or in that authentic state. And going back to the idea of othering, and one thing I've really appreciated about our party is the collection and the not denying everybody's different ideas. There's so many different types of transhumanists, and we, even in the officers, we all have varying different beliefs and ideas, and it's embraced. We're not homogeneous. And I think one of the solutions to the othering problem is making it a grander problem. I think of lately, I've been noticing a lot more, maybe it's just the algorithm of my feed, but I'm seeing a lot more clips of animals showing a really high state of consciousness, and dogs that are playing Jenga well, and other examples of animals showing a real qualia of ability. And I have a theory that is we're going to see more of these things, because we subconsciously maybe recognize the threat of artificial intelligence, that we will no longer be at the top of the intellectual food chain. And so maybe subconsciously we are gathering biological conscious allies that we're going to be paying more attention to animals. And look at, we're kind of in a way preparing unconsciously for this onslaught of an artificial intelligence. That's one theory. But I mean, that any threat like that makes a group of people come together. And I think Reagan even mentioned it in a UN speech years ago, that he always wondered if an alien invasion came, that all of our problems would go away. And we've seen that in American in history. In any threat from another country or a war makes us lose all of our political nuance, and we come together. We haven't seen a lot of that lately, but that's the sophistication of the algorithms, I think. But anyway, I think that's the solution is more othering, but in a broader way. And it's not the ultimate solution. It's not an ultimate way to solve this thing. But I think any threat will make people become more tribal. And AI might do that for us, unfortunately. Alien invasion or alien awareness might do that for us. But another thing I really like about what we have been doing politically is not taking strong stances on really controversial issues. I know a couple of months ago, somebody asked, where does USTP stand on abortion? And I was like, well, there's thousands of issues that we can take a stand on. We don't need to go there, because that will split us, that will divide us in two. And USCP seems like we have controlled entropy, ideas and points of view are so varied, but like the as above, so below, like the body is trillions of micro consciousnesses, there is a governing principle that makes us one entity. And we need as varying types of people as there are types of genes and types of cells in our body. And so I just think that we need to really embrace that and avoid taking stances on very controversial, issues, and appreciating other people's point of view, but somehow controlling the entropy that we're experiencing.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons why we've said quite often we have a transpartisan perspective, that we don't let ourselves be mired in this conventional partisan trench warfare. If an issue is particularly divisive for people today, it might be worthwhile to take a few steps back and consider, why is it that it is so divisive? And what changes, especially changes brought about by technological progress, could actually render it a non-issue going forward, like with the abortion issue, ectogenesis or artificial wombs, they've been mentioned in the chat for this salon as well, could render the entire issue moot, because if a woman has a choice to terminate the pregnancy, but that doesn't terminate the fetus could be brought up in this artificial womb. That resolves what is seemingly an intractable dilemma, given the technological realities of our time. And likewise, I think for every hot button issue today, transhumanists would be able to think of a constructive win-win solution for everybody with enough ingenuity and technological advancement. Now, I'd like to hear from Art Ramon. What do you think can be done in terms of leveraging the ideas of transhumanism to transform politics for the better and address some of these serious risks and problems that David mentioned?
Well, what I saw the current administration do is create Space Force. And Space Force being military, they're going to get a lot of funding for transhumanist tech. And I see the first transhumans being in the Space Force. So if you want to be a transhuman this decade, join Space Force. So hopefully with some of the developments that happen and we actually start to see real transhumans in space, that could possibly shift the politics. I don't know. It's once we have that model transhuman, and Space Force is going to be there to kind of protect a lot of that infrastructure in space. What's the name? The space. Was it, Elon Musk Starlink. So it's going to be there to protect that infrastructure, possibly moon mining, and I think once you start gathering resources from off-world, that could help with the politics here on the planet. So yeah, I see progress,
Yes, indeed. And perhaps this is another aspect that we could credit at least somewhat to Donald Trump's administration, apart from the fact that he didn't invade other countries. He also founded the Space Force, and perhaps that could be a foundation for a real viable space defense initiative against nuclear weapons going forward. So let's use what we have. No matter what the origins of those kinds of initiatives are. And I've always been one to say, I'm willing to recognize when Donald Trump does something praiseworthy, just as I'm willing to recognize when Joe Biden does something praiseworthy. And I think it's worthwhile to focus on the good in those politicians, because there may be occasions when we might be able to influence them in a beneficial direction. So now, David, you've heard from the panel, and I am curious if your voice is up to it. Do you have any perspectives to share on this?
I'm afraid my voice is likely to give way soon. Ideally, in any case, I would have a powerful basso profundo voice, because being primitive primates, people are more impressed by people with powerful, deep voices. However, no, I just want, in terms of, although in many ways transhumanists may be extremely radical, one of the rare human Darwinian values that is worth protecting and preserving is democracy. And I'm not saying this in some vulgar populist sense, and obviously we are all too aware of the horrendous problems of democracy, but democracy does provide a measure of accountability, peaceful transfer of power. And though maybe, at some distant time in the future, we can imagine offloading political decision-making to AI or anything, living in the 20th century, I think it's really important to preserve democracy, democratic institutions. Of course, as dictators the world over have pointed out, democracy is divisive and inefficient. So from the perspective of, running a transhumanist party, does one have all the kind of, elections, trappings of democracy and so on? And I don't have a pat answer here, because it can be extraordinarily divisive. But certainly at the political level, it's very easy to take for granted democratic institutions. But as we are now witnessing, when we have a president who is essentially trying to subvert the popular vote, I hope this ends well. But yeah, I think transhumanists need to be Democrats. However radical we are in some respects, and talking about life based on gradients of superhuman bliss and effectively quasi-immortal lifespans, super intelligence, the whole panoply of really far out there stuff. Yeah, in one respect at least, I think it's really important to stress democracy and accountability.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, one of the significant areas of discussion within the Transhumanist Party has been how to make democracy more representative. So we see in the United States this first past the post plurality, winner takes all types of system. And it has been quite divisive. It has been quite deleterious. We have been discussing many measures such as ranked preference voting, which we implement in our own internal votes, as well as proportional representation, reforms to the primary system, abolishing the electoral college, which is a particular problem in the United States, and implementing secure electronic voting systems for all. All of those could help make democracy more democratic, more representative of the will of the people. It does seem like these days democratic systems are all too easy to manipulate based on the formal rules, the criteria for victory, as well as just propaganda. The fact that the media do tend to serve as propagandists for one side or another, or just in terms of what they choose to cover or what they choose to omit, how very little coverage is given to other political parties in the United States besides the Republicans and the Democrats. So all of those are issues, I think, that can be worked on within the framework of a democratic society. I do think sometimes many of the problems that people attribute to democracy are the result of these kinds of imperfections within the system that lead the people to feel like they have constraints on what they may choose. So they choose something they don't actually agree with. Like the vast majority of Republicans did not have Donald Trump as their first choice in the Republican Party primaries, but as more and more contenders were filtered out, they felt like they had to side with the winner. And likewise, the Democrats generally were suspicious of Hillary Clinton, but they felt like they had to support her because Donald Trump was the greater evil. And in this election, the lesser evil calculus was in play as well. Many people who voted for Biden didn't vote for Biden because he was their first choice. They thought Biden could provide a reprieve from Donald Trump, and he was the option on the ballot that they thought could viably defeat him. So there's a lot of discussion that goes on with regard to how do we reform incentive systems and how do we influence enough politicians to actually implement those reforms. I think the greatest near-term improvement could be if more states adopt ranked preference voting. In Maine, that had passed previously in 2016, and other states have had those initiatives on their ballots as well. But we know that this salon has lasted now for over 3 hours, and we thank you for spending so much time with us in recognition of your voice. I do hope that you would be able to offer some closing remarks on the conversation in general, summing up the discussion perhaps, or taking it in a different direction, or if there's something new and insightful that you feel like you've gained from this conversation, feel free to let us know about that.
Gennady, well, yeah, very many thanks for inviting me to this salon. Though my voice is going now. If anyone has follow-ups that they would like to see addressed and properly tackled, I'm very happy to do so, either in a postscript to this salon or by text or follow-up. Apologies anyone who feels that we haven't tackled any any burning issues or skimmed others. No, really, I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing. As I said, it's I'm always impressed by people who get things done. I mean, this is it. If one is by temperament a philosopher, one writes something, thinks it's luminously self-evident, and then is mystified why other people don't see likewise. And yeah, I'm just to conclude, going back, I started off by saying simplistically, transhumanism, the three supers: super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. Statistically, probably more transhumanists are focused either on super intelligence or super longevity. But I very much hope the strand of transhumanism that is focused on the problem of suffering for humans and non-humans doesn't get neglected, continues to be an integral part of the movement. And if they're done well, I think the three supers complement each other, because other things being equal, happy people lead longer lives and they want to protect and preserve life. And I would love to see a civilization of fanatical life lovers dedicated to the well-being of all sentients. And it's not going to be me who leads the troops to victory, but yeah, thanks for what you're doing in the United States. If I can help at all, please let me know. But yeah, in the meantime, yeah, just keep up the fantastic work. I can't thank you enough.
Yes, wonderful words, David. Thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your insights today. And there was such an abundance of questions in the chat that despite the 3 hours and 10 minutes that we had, we could not possibly address them all. So if I left out any questions, as David said, please feel free to reach out to him and ask for his perspective on these issues. And I would like to point out a comment from one of our viewers that really is quite flattering. This person said, these virtual enlightenment salons are like a day spa for intelligence. So thank you, Daniel Twett, for that remark. This is what we aim to achieve, an ongoing conversation about the issues that matter most to humanity, creating interdisciplinary connections, carrying on the spirit of the 18th century age of enlightenment into the 21st century. And with that, please tune back in every Sunday, generally at 1 p.m. US Pacific time, for more of these kinds of enlightening conversations. And until then, live long and prosper.